Hello, Bishop Barron. We just saw a screening of The Divine Plan in Santa Barbara here, and looking forward to discussing the film with you. I've learned from doing a lot of events like this and screenings like this, you have a golden opportunity after someone who's sat through the film to get their gut reactions at first before we get too analytical or even theological, philosophical about the film. So do you want to express any gut reactions to start with?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought it was a compelling story. Just in itself is a compelling story. You know, going back to like Paul Kengor's book and others, but I thought the film did it in a very rich way, and the visual evidence, you know, is compelling. So all that I think was very rich. I enjoyed it.
So you mentioned the style, which I hear a lot of feedback on, like the style of the film seems to be sometimes capable of reaching a younger audience or a more hip audience sometimes because it does put it in a style. What did you think of the idea of history being expressed in this graphic novel or comic strip style?
Yeah, I thought the combination was good. You had a lot of film from the time and photographs from the time, but also, as you say, kind of the graphic novel thing, which I think was good, and it probably will appeal across different demographics. So I thought that was good. But I think it's always the narrative itself, isn't it? It's always the drama itself that you find most interesting and that grabs your attention and holds it. And I think it's just an inherently dramatic story. So I think that came through very clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I say sometimes jokingly, people will say, well, what was that you did where you kind of put all the events in a row and they kind of one flows into the other? I was like, you mean the story?
Yeah, right.
The narrative? You mean the plot? You know,
Yeah.
But the plot is the organizing principle of a story, and usually the theme is the content that's expanded as a result of the plot. So one of the words that you used when we did your interview for the film, which is a phrase now since I know a lot more about, is theodrama.
Right.
When you experience this film, do you think of it as a theodrama, or if you reflected on it at all, and why, if that's the case?
Well, that's what it was. That's what makes that story and your film so compelling, is that it is telling the theodramatic tale. So you could look at these two figures psychologically, politically, culturally, but what's really interesting is you look at them theodramatically. What's God up to? Now, God always works with our freedom, that's true, and God works through the political and the cultural, but what's really interesting is what is God up to? And these two men who understood that, and that's very rare, especially today in our hyper-secularized society, but these two men in key positions of leadership worldwide who understood the importance of the theodramatic, that's what makes the film really interesting.
Yeah, and when you said that, I had not heard that phrase before, but since I've realized, I think I'm always on some level trying to tell a theodrama, I started to think of the plays and the films I'm very interested in. They have existential themes, but a lot of them are trying to grapple with the idea of theodrama, but I learned through Balthasar that the opposite of theodrama is egodrama.
Yeah.
So can you try and explain for us what the difference would be? Because some would argue that Hollywood is merely the egodrama, and by doing a theodrama, you're challenging it by trying to what? What do you?
Well, in a way, I mean, the egodrama is the drama that I'm writing and I'm producing and I'm directing and I'm starring in. So that's the drama that most of us like to act out. And if we think about our lives, we think of them egodramatically. Like, okay, well, what do I want to accomplish? What's the plot I want to write? How should I produce and direct and light this story so that I'm really the prominent figure? How do I see everyone else in my life as my supporting cast? That's the egodrama. It's a sinful consciousness, right? The theodrama breaks in when you say, I realize my life is not about me. I'm part of something much bigger than my own projects and plans. I'm part of a divine plan. And that's why I love that phrase that Ronald Reagan picked up and then incorporated clearly in his own thinking and writing and activity. When you realize that, you know, my life is not about me, it's about God and God's purposes through me. So the wonderful thing is it doesn't denigrate the self, it elevates the self. You find who you really are when you surrender to God's purposes. What's lovely about the film is that it shows how this actually happened in the lives of these two men, both of whom had a key sense that their life was not finally about them, that they were chosen and they were equipped for a particular task in God's plan. And they found themselves in their surrender to it. That's a lovely story to tell because that has resonance for everybody, right? Everybody in the world has to come to grips with that because that's what God wants for all of us. And we get stuck in the egodrama, which is such a boring story, finally. Even if I'm this glittering star in the eyes of the world, that's a finally very dull story. And it makes me unhappy and radiates unhappiness around me. But when you find your role in the theodrama, you found the pearl of great price. You found the treasure buried in the field. And so what's cool about the story you're telling there is these two men who find that for themselves, but see, that redounds then to the good of the world. The ego drama radiates unhappiness. That's the sign of it. The indicator of the theodrama is it radiates liberation and life and enhancement. And that's really the story that this film is telling.
So just to stay on the theme of theodrama for a second and dig a little deeper, because it's something I discovered which was fascinating to me, being a film guy first, but knowing a bit about theology and history. Reading Balthasar's work, he also tracks the progression or digression of history of plays. He doesn't get into film quite as much, but the history of plays and how they digress to a detachment between the main character and the larger scheme that God or the gods play in Greek drama or otherwise. I thought that was fascinating because I thought of 6 characters in search of an author. I don't know if you're familiar with Pirandello or Beckett's.
Yeah.
What's Beckett's?
Waiting for
Godot.
Yeah.
And then I thought of Blade Runner, which was the 6 characters, but how on some level all of them are children looking for a father figure or waiting on a father figure. And I think this best, these are great examples for what you just said, that if there's no connection to the script writer or the one behind the play, then even the most meaningful acts will deteriorate into an isolation. Existentially, which is where we find ourselves in the modern world, and happens to be the films I am attracted to because it seems to speak to the modern condition.
No, quite right.
You could probably say it better than I did.
The central preoccupation of a lot of modern thinkers and modern actors is freedom, but freedom construed as self-assertion. So I find my path. I find myself. I mean, watch almost every movie today out of Hollywood. They will focus finally on that dilemma. I'm under pressure here and there, but I finally find my own voice. Well, the problem with that is it, as Balthasar points out, is it isolates finally the ego drama. You authentically find who you are when you discover your life isn't about you, when you've heard a call from a higher producer and director, right, who wants to situate you in this play. And then you find your true freedom. So your film is a lot about freedom because Reagan used that language a lot. So did John Paul. But John Paul famously said, freedom is not the ability to do whatever I want. It's the right to do as I ought. And there's a world of difference between those two things. The ego-dramatic understanding of freedom is the first one, is I do what I want. But the theodramatic is, I have the right to do, as I ought, what God is calling me to. What bugged John Paul, and I think Reagan too, about Soviet communism, was that it precluded that right. It took away from people the right to do as they ought, So they weren't advocating a sort of modern Western sense of freedom. They both had a deeply biblical understanding of freedom. That makes a big difference.
And I think this is where the theology of the cross comes in and the idea of the freedom of the cross, because I keep saying the cross is not a teaching or a thought, it's an action.
Yeah.
So it's acted out dramatically so others understand the meaning inside of it. Can you play with that a little bit? Because I was seeing the film in that light show actors on a stage performing a truth, not telling a truth, which is, I think, what the modern condition is in politics and even theology. We're arguing thoughts and missing that it's, and by the way, for the West, a very romantic, dramatic thought.
No, quite right. At the heart of Christianity is not just an abstract teaching. It's a drama. It's the journey of the Son of God into God-forsakenness so that he might lead us out of that condition back to union with the Father. So it's an essentially dramatic story, reaching its climax, quite rightly, on the cross, which, viewed from a worldly perspective, is nothing but failure. So here's this young man nailed to an instrument of torture, rejected by society, rejected by the religious establishment of his time. His friends have abandoned him. There it is. In the eyes of the world, that's nothing but failure. But seen theodramatically, it's the climax of the great story. And every Christian, certainly, identifies with that whatever route I take in my theodrama will have a cruciform quality to it. See, because it'll involve my journey under God's grace into some form of God-forsakenness that I might bring the light of grace there, right? So think of those two figures, both of whom were shot within the 6 weeks of each other. Talk about a cruciform moment. But see, every time you walk the path of the theodrama, you're walking a cruciform path. It's a path of self-gift. It will culminate in something like the cross, But the cross precisely is opening the door to the fullness of life and the fullness of grace. And so, yeah, Christian life always has that theodramatic structure.
So if I could play a little Jordan Peterson here for a second and bend that a little bit out of the literal more toward the figurative or the archetypal of the story, which is the universal. Whether you involve God or not, it is the universal structure of the story. What symbolically would you say in our modern world could be an act that's redemptive in nature for a popular audience today to understand this in modern film? Or maybe a film you've seen where you feel like, I think you mentioned once Clint Eastwood's Torino, Gran Torino.
Gran Torino's a beautiful example of
it. Can you, because I think sometimes the risk is if we talk historically, even though we know there's universal truths to the cross, a lot of people think, oh, there you go, they went to the Bible. They went 2,000 years ago, lost me, and I'm trying to speak to a mainstream audience, so can you elaborate?
Well, stay with the Clint Eastwood movie, which I think is one of the very best Christ figures in the last 50 years in cinema. Someone who willingly goes into a very dark place to do two things. One is to expose deep injustice, so to bring the perpetrators of evil out of hiding, so to speak. And also in the very same act, to liberate someone in the thrall of those dark powers. So it's an exposing sort of move, and it's a liberating move. And it happens precisely through the gift of his life. So it's a spoiler alert, of course, but the main character, Clint Eastwood himself, who sacrifices himself, who accepts death, so as to do those two things. And see, that's precisely what happens on the cross of Jesus, is the dysfunction of the world is fully exposed and then a path toward life. Now, in the story you're telling in this movie, John Paul and Reagan, there's something similar going on because both those figures were willing to bring to light the deep injustice of Soviet communism. They weren't willing to compromise with it. They didn't want to play games with it. They wanted to shed light on how dysfunctional this was. That's a theodramatic move because they were willing to go into, as it were, the belly of the beast. Now, not as clearly in Reagan's case, but certainly in John Paul's case, if the consensus is right that the communist empire, broadly speaking, was behind the assassination attempt. You pay a price for that. I mean, to do that is a very self-sacrificial move. So I think, take from Gran Torino to John Paul II and Ronald Reagan, there's a similar theodramatic archetype, if you want.
And floating this, I've floated this idea several times, and sometimes it sticks, and sometimes it may or may not be the right audience, or the word might be too strong when I speak of John Paul II as a messianic figure, and I don't mean to replace Christ, but the idea that people lose the idea that Jesus was a king. He was coming into town, and that his coming into town on the donkey was a mocking of Caesar.
Yeah.
And it was a political statement of saying, well, you think Caesar looks like that, and this is what Caesar looks like when the Son of God, Son of Man comes in. I always thought of John Paul II going into Poland with the communists watching him. Maybe they weren't Romans or Sadducees, but can you speak to, does that register as true for you? And maybe you could simplify it? Or
Sure. Well, you mentioned the word Messiah, Mashiach, the Anointed One. And every baptized Christian is baptized into Christ. So we are meant to be, in that sense, messianic, all of us. We're meant to be, C.S. Lewis put it this way, little Christ. So the purpose of Christian life is not just to become a nicer person. I hope that happens too, but is to become a little Christ. In other words, you live in the space opened up by Jesus. You walk the same path. And you, yes, exemplify to the world what real kingship looks like. So the world will say it looks like wealth and power and pleasure and honor. And we know it looks like the cross of Jesus. It looks like self-sacrificing love. And that's the way the world ought to be run. And yes, John Paul II, in that very dramatic way, on the world stage, exposed the dysfunction of the Soviet and Polish leadership, and he exemplified the right manner of leadership. That's a Christ-like move, absolutely. It's not messianic in the sort of egotistical way, but it's becoming a little Christ, doing what Christ did now in our setting. He certainly knew about that.
So one other observation I made about their character was they also understood people in their human subjectivities. And I thought there's a humility to this that's absent in our modern discourse of films and politics. They were, I call them Christian humanists. It meant that they understood the journey by which people come to Christ could be so vastly different, that it wasn't as simple as pounding a Bible or quoting verses, and that the whole world would come to culturally different. And I think that largesse of heart, of passion, of empathy allowed them to reach out to so many people and be transcendent figures. And I tried to capture that in the film. Did you see that theme coming through and how they related to others?
Oh, I think so. And I think you're right about using the word humility in regard to both of them. They weren't grandiose figures, even though they were major players on the world stage, but they inhabited it in that humble way because they inhabited it theodramatically. That's true. If they were grandiose figures, they wouldn't have drawn people to them. They would have put people off or oppressed them, That's the usual approach. But when you do it in that humility of spirit, then you do have this extraordinary appeal. And I think they both had that. And yeah, that comes through to me clearly in the film.
So wrapping it up a little bit here with maybe the last two questions, but to wrap it up, I'm thinking of the theodrama kind of finding me in a way as I went on my journey, but with somewhat of a teacher's motivation. At some point I felt like just making straightforward, entertaining films was, I might be missing the mark, because I felt like the culture generally was getting so coarsened to the idea of interacting with faith as a subject matter or even a component of. So I almost had to take a documentary turn to try and teach the antecedents of a world where faith played a large role. And do you confront this in your own ministry? I want to speak to that audience about why documentaries now, why not just make entertaining films and this theodrama journey?
Yeah. Oh no, I definitely confront secularism in all sorts of ways. And there's nothing in the world wrong with entertainment. I'm all in favor of it. But if your whole life is focused on those big four, wealth, pleasure, honor, and power, again, in themselves not bad things, but if they become the focus of your life, eventually it will empty out. What you need is to put all four of those things within the wider context of what God wants, what God desires. And so I think whatever helps people to see that properly theological dimension of life, that will make them much happier people. And again, it's not a puritanical move. It's not to say God as opposed to all that. It's God, now I can see how wealth, pleasure, honor, power can properly be used. Augustine said, love God, and then love everything else for the sake of God. That's it. That's all of life. You want throw away all the other self-help books. That's it. Put that on your computer screen. Love God. Love everything else for the sake of God. And I think the two people you portray here got that. They both understood it. Look at Ronald Reagan talk about wealth, pleasure, power, honor. He had all those things, but he put them in a higher context. John Paul wasn't personally wealthy, but he had all kinds of the other goods of the world. Okay, but he knew how to use them. He knew how to use them. Otherwise, they'll use us, and that's just a basic truth of life. If we don't put those things in the context of God, they will use us and destroy us. That's where addiction comes in. But the theodramatic perspective allows you to situate all those things properly, and then you use them precisely for the good of the world. See? And that's what those two men, I think, understood and did, more importantly.
So wrapping up, I'll ask you the proverbial. We didn't have this conversation. The film ended. You're in the car in the parking lot. You're going home. What's the takeaway? If you're with three other people who didn't see the film, and say, hey, what's the takeaway here? If you had to put it in a nutshell for my audience.
The takeaway is God is an actor in history. And you won't understand history properly unless you see that. And this story, which is about two great human actors, but helps us to see that it's the divine actor that's actually the most compelling actor on the stage.